We're within this whole concept, just to kind of get big picture thing. We're here in talking about decision making, and we've seen that decision making can be improved by using a rational decision making model. And effectively, the rational decision making model says get as much information as you can to solve a problem that you've well determined, and weigh all the alternatives. Once you've weighed the alternatives, pick the best alternative, and that will give you the best decision. So that's effectively the theme of the rational decision making model. We've also seen that things get in the way of rational decision making, such as biases and people's personality, people's moods. These things can come into play too. Today, we're going to look at this issue of groups and how groups can improve decision making using the rational decision making process. But the fact is, it's two heads are better than one, and several heads are better than two. So the group decision making is looked at as one of the things that will help overall decision making in our world. So many organizations use groups rather than individuals, especially when problems are not very well structured, right? If we've talked about this ill-structured problem thing, and the groups bring. Research has shown that groups can bring some advantages. It also comes with disadvantages, but the advantages outweigh the disadvantages. And if you just look at group versus individual decision making, this occurs in your book, and we talk about the various effectiveness criterias here on the left. We talk about groups and we talk about individuals. Groups certainly have an ability to look at a broader range of information. So you got more complete information and more people to look at it from different perspectives. It helps eliminate biases, because if my bias is one way and your bias is another way, they'll cancel out. So effectively, the thinking of biases will give you a better perspective in terms of more complete. Diversity of views, this is what's always important. And we're going to talk about how this diversity of views actually gets shrunk down as teams, they form, they storm, they norm, and then they adjourn. They perform and then they adjourn. We've seen that some of the norming problems of groups is that the diversity of views, which they have at the beginning when everyone got a different perspective, is good. But as groups get a little familiar with each other, they tend to be less. This issue of groupthink, it's what's called groupthink, creeps in, and we got to be wary of that. But the fact of the matter is that under normal circumstances, groups do tend to bring more perspectives on a problem. The decision quality for groups tends to be much better than non-groups. It's just a matter of that, again, more perspectives and more information lead to better problem solving. The accuracy of information, again, more people looking at it, more eyes on it, more creativity, more ideas come to the fore. One of the great things with groups is the degree of acceptance. If you're a group member and I'm a group member, we've all had a say into this decision-making process, the number of people who are going to agree with it are going to go up instrumentally. Because if I made the decision and you had nothing to do with it, the chances are you're going to be thinking, is that the best decision? Should I agree with that? Probably not. Whereas if you're part of the decision, you're more likely to agree with it. The downside, however, with groups is that, wow, it takes a long time to make a decision. Look at government. Government is all about, it is an embodiment of group decision making. We elect people who are there acting as a group that will make decisions on our behalf. It takes a long time to get a good decision, because the fact is all of the pluses that we talked about, it's more complete information, diversity of views, higher quality, more accuracy, more creativity, more degree of acceptance. The challenge with that is that it got to go through more eyeballs and more people questioning, and it slows down the decision-making process. So speed is not such a good thing with groups, and nor is efficiency, because groups, again, getting everyone together, getting people's schedules lined up, it can be challenging to do that. So sometimes groups tend to be not as efficient at getting the problem solved either. Really, we need to think about what kind of a problem do we have, and ask ourselves, is this better to be done by a group or better to be done by an individual? So I just fleshed out these a little bit more here on these coming slides here, where we look at decision quality. Groups certainly make higher quality decisions than individuals because groups are more vigilant, can generate more ideas, and can evaluate ideas better than individuals. They can also bring better acceptance and commitment. Often the decision made by a group is more likely to be accepted. The acceptability of group decisions is especially useful in decision implementation, since commitment is raised up as individuals are more willing to follow through on stuff that they've had some input into. And the fusion of responsibility. This is a good one too. Don't blame me, blame the group is what we mean by fusion of responsibility. Each member of the group shares the burden of a task. If we're going to have to do major cuts, you're not going to look at me as the one who made the cuts. It is our group made the cuts. So it kind of inoculates individuals from grief by spreading the grief over a whole bunch of individuals. But many organized decisions are made by groups rather than individuals, especially when the problems are ill-structured. And, we got more advantages here. Research has shown that groups produce more and better solutions to problems than individuals working alone. Certain conditions should enable groups to perform better than individuals. Group members differ in their relevant skills. So we bring people together who have certain skills in marketing, certain skills in finance, certain skills in accounting, certain skills in economics. Bringing those all together will allow the combination of all those skill sets to produce a better decision. It also creates conflict, of course, because one's perspective is going to be very different than others. The memory for facts. One of the things that a group does is it has something called a collective wisdom. And the collective wisdom comes by the fact that some of the group members have been there longer than others. They have a longer term memory, a corporate memory it's called, of what worked before, what didn't work before, what's been tried, what's not been tried. And the memory for all of these facts help, again, influence the decision making in the present and affect the quality of it. And individual judgments are obviously combined and weighted to reflect the expertise. We've seen that the big disadvantages are it takes a lot more time. Groups seldom work quickly and efficiently compared to individuals. I can make a decision just like that. A group, you're going to take longer. Conflict. Participants in group decisions often have their own personal axes to grind. I don't like that type of thing. I'm not going to support that. Whereas the other four people love that sort of thing. They're going to support it, right? So it brings this conflict. But again, coming out of that conflict, provided it's used correctly, can help benefit the decision. So political wrangling and infighting can be negative, but it also can be positive in order to reach a better compromise and a better decision. We also have the problem of domination in the groups, where you have one person who has a very big ego and can sway the rest of the group. So group decisions can be swayed by a very prominent individual, or small group of individuals can get together and throw off the decision. You can get a subgroup, such as what we call a coalition of members who raise a point and try to force the group to go in another direction. And as I mentioned, this concept of groupthink, it happens when the group pressure leads to a reduced mental efficiency, poor testing and reliability, and lacks moral judgment. People just say, it's going to go that way anyway. I'm going to vote with the group so I don't have too much grief. In terms of a more modern example of groupthink, the 1986 loss of the Challenger. The Challenger disaster was a case study in groupthink. Back in 1986, the space shuttle program had been running for about 5 years. NASA wanted to bring the idea of going to space into about as commonplace as setting off on an airplane and flying somewhere. So the group that ran NASA in terms of decision making for launching the shuttles, they had a lot of pressure put on them to make that shuttle live up to its promise. Well, on this day in January of 1986, the Challenger was ready for liftoff, and the temperatures at the time were really low. It was below freezing in the morning, just before the machine took off. Some people from the Martin Thiokol company, which made the solid rocket boosters, which were the two big motors on the side, they sent emails saying that they didn't think it was a good idea to launch the Challenger because they didn't think that the cold would help the engines and that could create some problems with the engines. But there was so much pressure amongst the NASA group and so much cockiness in terms of their experience before that they went ahead and launched shuttle. And 76 seconds into the flight, this is what happened. We saw it explode. The 7 crew members were killed, one of which was a teacher. And it was a very dramatic and traumatic incident for the public as well as NASA. There was a report done on it, and one of the findings of the report was that NASA suffered from groupthink, in the sense that every one of the people around the committee who made the decision to launch that shuttle did not really consider all of the factors. They just wanted to get the machine off the ground. And it was a real upcoming for the organization. These things, when we think about the symptoms of groupthink, all of these existed in the Space Shuttle Challenger. We had an illusion of invulnerability, meaning we can do anything. Nothing bad is going to happen. An overconfidence. An assumption of morality. Really, we had to get that shuttle in space. We weren't too worried about the fact that some 7 people could be killed. You know, the idea was we had a schedule and we had to live up. Rationalized resistance. The Morton Thiokol people had sent a whole bunch of correspondence that morning saying, no, it's not a good idea to launch that shuttle. But there was a resistance to that. No matter how strongly the evidence might have contradicted the basic assumptions, that was generally ignored. Peer pressure. A lot of the group members felt, again, pressure to get that machine off. They had fallen behind on their schedule, and they did not like the idea of the project getting a black eye because of that constant delay. There was a minimizing of doubts. As I said, go back to the Thiokol people. They said we shouldn't do it. They just said they were just worry warts. And there was an illusion of unanimity, meaning that when it was all over and done and everyone looked at it, they said, I thought all of us agreed to launch this thing. The report that was done after showed that no, there were people that did not want it to launch, but they were ignored. So groupthink is always a concern whenever you're dealing with groups, particularly when the groups get familiar with one another and that there's very little in terms of someone standing up and saying, this is not a good decision. So we could think about effectiveness of groupthink, okay? And we've got some effectiveness criteria down the side of this: the number and quality of ideas, social pressure, money, speed, task orientation, potential conflict, commitment to a solution, development of group cohesiveness. So we got all of these potential criteria, and we've got different types of groups. Now we got an interacting group, groups that are face-to-face with one another. A brainstorming group, they're just a group that comes together to push ideas. A nominal group, which is your regular run-of-the-mill group, nothing in particular. An electronic group, which is what we have now. You know, you think about people in the pandemic are very seldom face-to-face, but they're all there on the email and they're all tasked with whatever they're tasked with. We see that different types of group will look at or facilitate, use, have, represent different effectiveness criteria. So, for example, the number and quality of ideas is rather low when we got an interacting group, more moderate with a brainstorming group, but very high with a regular nominal group. And they're high with an electronic group. If you think about a nominal group and an electronic group, they're both about the same. It's just one's in person, the other one is not in person. Social pressure, again, whenever you have groups that are face-to-face, you tend to have higher social pressure. So interacting groups and nominal groups tend to be, a higher end for social pressure. Money costs, well, seeing that groups aren't really, if we look at the cost of running the group, it's not overly high to start with. Electronic groups may be higher, not so much in today's world. We got internet technology and the like, so it shouldn't be that bad. Speed, and again, groups are slower. Every one of these are rated at moderate. Task orientation, or how focused they are on the task. Well, interacting groups could be lower, brainstorming could be higher, nominal higher, electronic could be higher. Interacting groups may not be as knitted together. Potential for conflict, you could think about interacting groups. They got to interact with one another, high. Brainstorming groups, well, they're just throwing out ideas. The idea behind brainstorming is you're not questioning the decision, you're just throwing out ideas. So relatively low, nominal, and low for nominal is moderate and electronic is low. Commitment to a solution. They're all fairly high or moderate. And brainstorming doesn't create solution. Brainstorming is just ideas. So that's why it's not applicable. And development of group cohesiveness, as groups move along, the groups that are close together would tend to be more cohesive. The ones that are further apart, like electronic, would not be. If we think about managing groupthink, because so many of our decision-making bodies are groups, what do we do to manage it? Well, the first thing we want to do is to make sure that the size does not get out of hand, okay? Most effective groups are less than 10 or a dozen. Once you move over that number of people, the group just doesn't work well. There's just too many characters, too many personalities, too many problems getting a group together. It just makes it very difficult. So we want to think about group size being limited to around 10 or a dozen. That moderates groupthink, but it also makes the group easier to work. We got to encourage group leaders to play an impartial role. The leaders of the group really need to be like the coaches and the referees. They need to be able to stimulate conversation, manage the conversation, and when required, stop the conversation if it's not productive. Appoint one group member to play a role of a devil's advocate. Again, when the definition of groupthink is everyone starts acting the same and thinking the same. So having a devil's advocate, which is really someone who pushes the opposite point of view, if there's always a devil's advocate, it's not a very fun role to play when you're the outsider, but what that does is it gets people to second guess or to think right. If you've ever seen or read 12 Angry Men, it's a story that is all about a jury that is deciding on a person's fate, and one person is opposed, and how that interaction of the single person who's opposed challenged the group. The other thing is to stimulate active discussion of diverse alternatives. Now that's the job of the group leader, right? To be able to get as much discussion from different perspectives as possible, because the idea of the group is to take all the ideas in and assess them and then make a good decision based on that. So what we want to do is get group members discussing things, talk about things, and it says requiring members to focus first on the negatives of the alternative, make the group less likely to stifle dissenting views. So it's just an approach that is taken where we assess the why we shouldn't do something first as opposed to what we should. How do groups handle risks? So when group members are initially more willing to take risks, they experience something called a risky shift after the discussion. When group members are somewhat conservative before interaction, they tend to exhibit a conservative shift when they discuss the problem. A conservative shift is a tendency for the group to make less risky decisions than the average risk initially advocated by the individual members. So risky and conservative shifts occur in a wide variety of real settings, including investment and purchasing decisions. The key factor appears to be the initial positions of the group members. So people tend to have a shift in their perspectives after some discussion. We could also think about groups adding to creativity, and what can we do in order to help groups become creative voices in an organization, come up with unique approaches? Well, things that can affect creativity at work can help groups become more creative. So challenge. Make sure things are always challenged. When people are matched up with the right assignments, their expertise and skills can be brought to the task of creative thinking. Individuals should be stretched, but not overwhelmed. So challenge them and not too much. Freedom to be creative. Once a person gets a project, he or she needs the freedom to determine the process. In other words, let the person decide how to tackle the problem. It heightens the intrinsic motivation. It's my problem to solve, and I'm using my tools to do it. Resources. Make sure that people got resources. Time and money are two main resources to affect creativity. All ideas are great, but they all cost money to implement. So we need to be able to provide the money. If we look at work group features, one discussion group, our discussion group of group composition and diverse concludes with diverse groups are likely to come out with more creative solutions. So, the more different the group is, more potential ideas. In addition to ensuring a diverse group of people, team members need to share excitement about the goal, must be willing to support each other through difficult periods, and must recognize that others' unique knowledge and perspectives are equally valid. We also need supervisory encouragement, to sustain passion. Most people need to feel that what they're doing matters. Managers can reward, collaborate, and communicate and nurture creativity in groups. And not only the managers, but the organization needs to support it. Creativity helps when the supporting organizations reward the creativity and they make sure that negative political problems don't get out of control. We also think about groups and ethical decision making. We talked about, this risky shift and the issues with invulnerability. Do groups make ethical decisions? Well, it really depends. It depends on where the group is with their moral development, how much control they feel they have, this locus control, and what is the environment of the organization. That's going to have an impact on ethical decision making. Okay, so if we think about the stage of moral development, we got to think about how moral are these people as individuals, right? And they run into what's called three stages: a pre-conventional stage, a conventional stage, and a principled stage. So pre-conventional, stick to the rules, avoid physical punishment, following rules only when doing so is in your immediate interest. So, decent. Then we move into more conventional, where maintaining conventional order by filling obligations to which you're agreed, living up to what's expected. And finally, we move into what's called a principle mode, which is following self-chosen ethical principles, even if they violate the law, valuing rights of others and upholding absolute values and rights regardless of the majority's opinion. So we can see that people will tend to become more principled over time. If we look at the locus of control, which is the degree to which you feel you have control over your environment, okay? It indicates that people with an external locus control, in other words, they believe that their lives are controlled by outside forces such as luck or chance, they're less likely to take responsibility for the consequences of their behaviors. They're more likely to rely on external influences to determine their behavior. They're going to blame someone outside. So internal locus control means that you control what's going on. External means someone else is controlling what's going on. Depending on your perspective, it's going to affect how you feel that you're going to take the blame or take the benefit. In terms of ethical decision making in organizations, an organizational environment refers to an employee's perception of the organization's expectation. Does the organization culture encourage and support ethical behavior by rewarding or discouraging unethical behavior or by punishing it? Is the organization putting his money where his mouth is, in other words? If we look at an ethical decision, there's really three questions that should come to you whenever you're faced with this problem. Is the decision motivated by self-interest or not? If it's not, you're good. If it is, if you feel self-interest is what's driving you, that's probably unethical. The next thing you ask, if you say no to the first one, is, does the decision respect the rights of the individuals affected? And if it doesn't respect the rights, it's probably unethical. If it does respect the rights, it's probably ethical, which will lead you to the next question, which is the decision fair and equitable? If you feel that it's fair and equitable, that means it's very ethical. And if it's not, it's unethical. I ran into this, we're in this situation now in my other job with the town where we had to make some tough decisions during this pandemic of whether or not to lay people off. You know, and when you as a group are taxed with that, you got people's lives in your hands. You know, you're going to say to someone that we're going to withdraw your employment, and you're going to have to go on unemployment insurance or employment insurance. And that's a pretty heavy decision to make. That's not something that you do lightly. And this process is useful whenever you hit those types of problems. You know, is the decision motivated by self-interest? I don't like the people that work for us, so I want to get rid of them. If that were the answer that I had to answer to that question, that first question, I'm going to say that's pretty unethical, and I shouldn't do that. If the answer was, you know, no, I have no self-interest in whether or not people get laid off or not, then I'm going to ask, is the decision respecting the rights of the individuals affected? Well, you know, is it respecting their rights? Probably. Well, they have a right to work, but on the other hand, in the environment we're in, it's understandable that if there's no work for people, you can't keep them on. So that one kind of sits on the fence. Does it respect their rights? Yeah, you know, we're not doing anything that we're being forced to make this decision. So I would tend to lean that a little bit no, but a little bit yes, and probably more yes. And then I asked, is the decision fair and equitable? Well, it's certainly fair and equitable from the taxpayer's point of view. Is it from the individual's point of view? Well, you know, we do have systems in place, and we are going to rehire once we get straightened away. So the meter would weigh more on the yes side, which would be more ethical. Still, very difficult decisions. Doesn't make these decisions any easier, that's for sure. So, you know, these are the things that you end up with whenever you're in organizations and you have to make these decisions, be it an individual decision or a group decision, and they can be challenging. So how can we reduce biases and errors? Well, you got to focus on the goal. Don't lose sight of why we're making this decision. What is the goal? Clear goals make decision making so much easier. We got to look for information that disconfirms your beliefs. So if you believe something, look for information that would be counter to what you believe. Is there a balanced argument? Are you aware of arguments on both sides? The group does a better job at putting forth counter arguments. As an individual, your job is to look for those counter arguments. Don't create meaning out of random events. Okay, things that happen, but let's not try to look too far into it. Ask yourself if patterns can be meaningfully explained or whether they are merely coincidence. Don't attempt to create meaning if there is none. And increase your options. The more alternatives you can generate, the more options you have. So do a good job at looking for alternatives. And then we finally, in terms of this ethical scenario, we're looking at the concept of corporate responsibility. Ethics and corporate responsibility go hand in hand. The ethics of a business, the business as an entity, is really known as corporate social responsibility. It's an organizational responsibility to consider the impact of its decisions on the greater society. Thus, organizations may try to better society through such things as charitable contributions or better wages to employees working in offshore factories, for example. Organizations may engage in those practices because they feel pressured by society or they feel that it's the right thing to do. You know, car companies making electric cars. Maybe they feel pressured, maybe they feel there's an economic argument, or maybe they feel it's the right thing to do. Okay, so in summary, then what we got to do is try to improve our decision making in an organization. And decision making is improved if decision makers are encouraged to approximate more closely the rational model. Okay, we want to be able to make our decisions as rationally as possible. And there's 5 techniques that are often used to encourage this close approximation. Training. train people to make better decisions. This idea of people understanding the concept of rational decision making is helpful in getting people to understand what we should do whenever we make a decision. So discussion leaders should provide some guidance without acting autocratically. Specifically, leadership behaviors can be learned through role play training, in which it's been shown to increase the quality and acceptance of group decisions. Stimulate and manage controversy. You got to be a disturber in some way or another. So as long as it doesn't become a full-blown conflict, controversy provokes new ideas, new thought, and it forces people to make a good, solid argument for a course of action. So in groups, controversy is stimulated by having members with diverse backgrounds, forming subgroups to tear the problem apart, and establishing norms of openness. The devil's advocate may be appointed to identify the challenges of weaknesses of proposed plan or strategy. We also look at something called traditional brainstorming. Now, brainstorming involves people to get together and throwing out ideas. No one criticizes any ideas. It's just a pure, unadulterated slew of ideas. So brainstorming attempts to increase the number of creative solution alternatives to problems by focusing on the idea generation rather than evaluation. Group members voice an idea to have in a freewheeling, non-critical environment. However, research on brainstorming has concluded that individuals working alone tend to generate more ideas than with groups interacting via computer, or it will help group performance if they work alone first. We also have, in this day and age, something called electronic brainstorming. It uses computer-mediated technology to improve traditional brainstorming practices. There's a really good program, and next week I'm going to look at it with you. And effectively, what this program does is it allows people to interact with you online using their cell phone. So I assume we all got cell phones. So we're going to look at this concept of electronic brainstorming using one of those tools, okay? So face-to-face interaction actually hinders effective brainstorming because people are afraid to say things. The good thing with electronic is people can easily say things and come up with ideas. We also got this thing called a nominal group technique. This is one of these idea-generating ideas that came up in the 1960s. And really, it's a structured group decision-making technique in which ideas are generated without group interaction. So effectively, what you do is you write down a bunch of ideas and you submit them to the group. And they're submitted and then they're evaluated by the group. So we separate the generation from the evaluation stage, and that's what's known as a nominal group technique.